The cruelest lies are the ones spoken by innocent people trying to save someone else. Dawn had barely touched the stone towers of the capital when the enormous execution square filled with restless whispers. Hundreds of citizens gathered behind wooden barriers, their voices blending into a low murmur that drifted beneath gray autumn skies. Merchants abandoned their stalls, nobles occupied the front rows, and travelers stood on crates simply to catch a glimpse of the young Omega whose confession had become the kingdom's greatest scandal. At the center of the square stood Evelyn Carter, a 22-year-old white-skinned Omega dressed in a simple cream-colored gown hidden beneath a worn brown cloak that no longer shielded her from countless judgmental eyes. Her wrists were loosely bound with ceremonial cord rather than heavy chains, a sign that she had surrendered willingly instead of resisting arrest. Yet nothing about her calm expression resembled guilt. Her blue eyes quietly wandered across the crowd, searching not for sympathy but for familiar faces she hoped had escaped unnoticed. Somewhere beyond the frightened citizens stood a young palace servant and an innocent family who still believed their future had been protected by her silence. That single thought brought more comfort than fear ever could. The chief judge slowly stepped onto the raised platform and unrolled a parchment bearing the royal seal. His voice echoed across the silent square as he announced that Evelyn Carter had freely confessed to stealing confidential royal records and attempting to conceal evidence belonging to the crown. The word spread through the crowd like cold wind. Some spectators nodded with satisfaction, convinced justice was finally being served. Others stared quietly at the young Omega, unable to understand why someone with such gentle eyes had admitted to such a serious crime without offering even the smallest explanation. Evelyn lowered her gaze as the accusations continued, accepting every sentence without protest. She had rehearsed this moment countless times inside her heart. If remaining silent allowed one innocent family to wake up together tomorrow, then every cruel rumor aimed at her had already become a price she willingly accepted. The chief judge paused before asking whether she wished to make one final statement before the sentence became permanent. A heavy silence settled across the square. Even the fluttering banners above the palace walls seemed to grow still. Evelyn slowly lifted her head, her voice soft but unmistakably steady as she requested only one final wish. She asked that no one search for the frightened servant who had disappeared 3 days earlier because that person had done nothing deserving punishment. Confused whispers immediately spread through the crowd. The judges exchanged uncertain glances, struggling to understand why a condemned woman would spend her final request protecting someone whose name she refused to reveal. The request made no sense unless the confession itself hid something far greater than anyone had imagined. Among the spectators, an elderly woman quietly wiped away tears while a young guard standing near the platform looked toward Evelyn with growing doubt instead of suspicion. For the first time since the trial began, certainty began slipping away from those who believed the case had already been solved. Then, somewhere beyond the eastern gates of the capital, the distant sound of galloping horses rolled across the valley. At first, only a handful of guards noticed it. The steady rhythm grew louder with every passing heartbeat until even the crowd turned toward the road leading into the city. Dust rose above the horizon beneath the pale morning light, and a royal banner bearing the silver crest of the Alpha King emerged through the haze. No one had expected him to return before the judgment was complete, yet the determined pace of the approaching riders made one thing unmistakably clear. Someone was racing against time itself, and before another word could be spoken from the platform, the fate of the innocent Omega was about to change forever. 3 days earlier, long before whispers of guilt spread across the kingdom, the village of Willow Creek welcomed another peaceful autumn morning beneath clear blue skies. Golden leaves drifted lazily across narrow dirt paths as smoke curled gently from stone chimneys and the scent of fresh bread floated through the cool air. Evelyn Carter began every morning the same way, carrying a woven basket filled with medicinal herbs gathered before sunrise from the nearby forest. The 22-year-old white-skinned Omega greeted every neighbor with the same warm smile, never expecting praise for the countless quiet kindnesses that filled her ordinary life. She helped an elderly healer prepare remedies for fever, bandaged the scraped knees of laughing children, and left baskets of fresh vegetables outside the homes of families struggling through the approaching winter without ever revealing who had delivered them. Many villagers admired her generous heart, although others dismissed her compassion as nothing more than the harmless innocence of an Omega who understood little about the complicated world beyond the village. Evelyn never argued with them. She believed kindness did not become more valuable simply because someone noticed it. Later that afternoon, after delivering medicine to an aging shepherd living beyond the tree line, Evelyn followed a narrow woodland trail leading back toward the village. The peaceful silence suddenly broke when she heard hurried footsteps rustling through fallen leaves. At first she assumed someone had become lost, but the frightened breathing that followed sounded far too desperate. Moving carefully through the trees, she discovered a young palace servant crouched behind an abandoned supply shed, desperately trying to hide beneath broken wooden crates. The frightened girl looked no older than 19, her hands trembling as she clutched a weathered leather satchel tightly against her chest. Her eyes widened with panic the moment she realized someone had found her. Before she could run again, Evelyn slowly raised both hands to show she meant no harm. She spoke softly, introducing herself before asking only whether the young woman needed help. The servant hesitated for several long moments before tears finally overcame her fear. Between broken breaths, she explained that her name was Lily Morgan and that she worked inside the Royal Archive at the capital. Earlier that morning she had discovered the leather satchel abandoned outside the archive entrance after finishing her cleaning duties. Believing it had simply been forgotten, she picked it up intending to return it, only to hear royal officials shouting that confidential records had been stolen. Panic had clouded every decision afterward. Afraid that no one would believe an ordinary servant carrying the missing satchel, she fled before anyone could question her. Now every road back to the capital seemed impossible. Evelyn listened without interrupting. She gently accepted the satchel and opened it only enough to recognize the royal seal pressed into several official documents. She immediately understood why Lily had been terrified. Even complete innocence could appear suspicious beneath the wrong circumstances. Looking directly into Lily's tear-filled eyes, Evelyn quietly promised that she would find a way to protect both the young servant and her family from a mistake that had never belonged to them. Lily desperately insisted that she could never allow another innocent person to suffer because of her fear. Evelyn answered with a gentle smile that sometimes courage began with allowing someone else to help carry the burden. Neither woman noticed a distant figure standing silently beyond the trees, watching them from the shadows before disappearing toward the road leading back to the capital. The promise Evelyn Carter made beneath the forest trees followed her home like a quiet shadow that refused to disappear. Long after the sun slipped below the hills and warm lights appeared inside the village cottages, she remained awake beside the small fireplace in the healer's home, staring at the royal satchel resting on the wooden table before her. Every possible choice seemed to end with someone losing everything. If she returned the satchel herself, Lily Morgan would almost certainly become the first suspect because too many people had already seen the frightened servant fleeing the capital. If Lily surrendered, her family could be destroyed by accusations before anyone listened to the truth. If they both remained silent, the missing royal records would trigger an even larger search throughout the kingdom. Evelyn quietly closed her eyes, remembering the terrified expression on Lily's face. She had seen fear before in injured children, lonely elders, and abandoned animals, but never had she seen someone convinced that telling the truth would only make everything worse. Before dawn arrived, Evelyn had already made the decision that would change her life forever. The following morning, the peaceful rhythm of Willow Creek vanished beneath the sound of approaching horses. Royal investigators entered the village wearing dark cloaks marked with the silver crest of the crown. Curious neighbors gathered along the streets as officials questioned merchants, farmers, and travelers about the missing royal documents. The lead investigator announced that anyone withholding information would be considered an accomplice to the theft. The warning spread quickly through the village, bringing worried whispers to every doorstep. Evelyn watched from outside the healer's cottage while Lily remained hidden inside a small storage room nearby, barely able to breathe. Their eyes met only once. Lily silently shook her head, begging Evelyn not to sacrifice herself for a mistake born from panic. Evelyn answered with the smallest reassuring smile before stepping away. She slowly approached the investigators with calm determination, carrying the weathered leather satchel in both hands. Every conversation around the village suddenly stopped. The lead investigator looked from the satchel to the young Omega standing before him and demanded to know where she had found the missing royal property. Evelyn lowered her eyes and quietly admitted that she had taken responsibility for the satchel after discovering the royal records. The investigator immediately asked why she had stolen confidential documents belonging to the crown. Evelyn never claimed she had stolen them. Instead, she simply answered that the satchel was in her possession and that she alone accepted responsibility for everything that had happened. The careful wording escaped the attention of nearly everyone listening. To the investigators, her willingness to accept blame sounded exactly like a confession. Villagers gasped in disbelief as whispers spread through the crowd. Some stared at Evelyn with disappointment while others refused to believe the gentle Omega could have committed such an act. The investigators offered her one final opportunity to identify anyone else involved. Evelyn calmly replied that no other innocent person should suffer because of her choices. Those words only strengthened the officials' belief that she was protecting unknown accomplices. As the investigators secured the satchel and prepared to escort Evelyn toward the capital, Lily watched from behind a narrow crack in the storage room door, tears streaming silently down her face. She nearly rushed outside more than once, yet every time she remembered Evelyn's promise to protect her family, her trembling legs refused to move. Evelyn climbed into the waiting carriage without resistance, giving the hidden servant one final glance filled not with regret but with quiet encouragement. Hours later, inside the royal palace hundreds of miles away, King Alexander Hawthorne returned from inspecting the northern borders. Among the many reports waiting upon his desk, one brief sentence immediately captured his attention. An Omega had confessed too easily. King Alexander Hawthorne had reviewed thousands of reports since ascending the throne, yet experience had taught him that the most dangerous lies were often hidden inside the shortest sentences. As evening settled over the royal palace, he stood alone inside the strategy chamber overlooking the capital through towering stone windows. Candles flickered across a massive oak table covered with maps, royal correspondence, and investigation records awaiting his attention after several days inspecting the northern borders. Among countless routine documents rested a single report describing the confession of a young Omega named Evelyn Carter. The report declared the case nearly complete, the evidence recovered, and the accused fully cooperative. Most rulers would have signed the final authorization without another thought. Alexander did not. He quietly read every page again, his sharp blue eyes lingering on details others had ignored. According to the investigators, Evelyn had immediately accepted responsibility for possessing the missing royal satchel yet had offered no explanation for why she supposedly stole confidential records. Stranger still, she had never attempted to flee after surrendering herself. The king leaned back in thoughtful silence. In his experience, truly guilty people usually tried to justify their actions, invent excuses, or shift blame onto someone else. Innocent people protecting others often did the opposite. They accepted punishment while refusing to explain themselves. That single observation refused to leave his mind. He summoned his most trusted investigator before midnight. When the veteran officer arrived, Alexander handed him the report without speaking. After several minutes, the investigator admitted that the confession appeared unusually simple. Alexander nodded. He instructed him to retrieve every original witness statement, archive inventory, and evidence record connected to the missing documents. Nothing was to be copied or summarized. He wanted the original pages exactly as they had first been written. He also ordered a discreet investigation that would remain unknown even to the officials already handling the case. The investigator understood immediately that the king suspected something far deeper than ordinary theft. Meanwhile, Evelyn arrived at the capital under quiet guard just as lanterns illuminated the palace walls against the darkening sky. She was escorted into a modest holding chamber overlooking the palace gardens rather than a crowded prison. The guards expected tears, anger, or desperate pleas, but instead found her sitting peacefully beside the narrow window watching autumn leaves drift across the pathways below. One young guard finally asked the question that had troubled him throughout the journey. Why would someone confess so calmly if there was still time to deny everything? Evelyn looked toward the moon rising above the palace towers before answering softly that some promises became more valuable than freedom itself. The guard could not understand her words, yet he sensed that her sorrow carried no trace of selfishness. Before leaving, he quietly placed a warm blanket beside her chair because the night air had grown cold. Evelyn thanked him with genuine gratitude, as though the small kindness meant far more than comfort alone. At the same time, Alexander received the first collection of original records. He noticed that one witness described the royal satchel as dark brown leather while another insisted it had been black with silver clasps. A third statement mentioned decorative markings that did not exist on official archive cases. The contradictions were impossible to ignore. Either several witnesses had never actually seen the missing satchel, or someone had encouraged them to repeat details they believed were true instead of what they had truly witnessed. Alexander closed the final document and slowly stood from his chair. Looking toward the silent city beyond the palace walls, he spoke quietly to himself. A truthful confession should simplify an investigation. This one had only made it more complicated. At that moment, he understood that Evelyn Carter was no longer merely the accused. She had become the center of a mystery someone inside the kingdom desperately wanted buried before the truth could ever be discovered. Before sunrise touched the palace towers, King Alexander Hawthorne quietly set his investigation into motion without informing the council that believed the case had already been solved. He trusted only 4 people with the assignment, each chosen because loyalty to truth mattered more than loyalty to reputation. Their instructions were simple. They were not searching for another suspect. They were searching for every detail that did not belong. While most officials prepared documents for Evelyn Carter's final hearing, the king's investigators returned to the royal archive where the missing records had first disappeared. Dust covered nearly every forgotten shelf inside the ancient stone building, yet one narrow aisle looked strangely cleaner than the others. The chief investigator carefully examined the polished wooden cabinets before noticing faint scrape marks along the floor beneath a storage chest that had clearly been moved only days earlier. Inside the chest, nothing appeared unusual except a loose wooden panel concealed beneath old inventory ledgers. Hidden below rested several discarded drafts of archive reports that should have been destroyed weeks earlier. None of them directly proved Evelyn's innocence, but each revealed small revisions made after the investigation officially began. Meanwhile, Alexander personally examined the original evidence inventory inside his private chamber. The recovered royal satchel had been logged into secure palace storage on the evening Evelyn surrendered herself. Yet when he requested the satchel for inspection the following morning, officials informed him it had already been transferred elsewhere. No written authorization accompanied the transfer. Someone had removed the kingdom's most important piece of evidence while claiming to follow routine procedure. Alexander quietly folded the inventory sheet and realized that whoever had planned the deception was no longer protecting the truth. They were protecting themselves. Across the palace grounds, Evelyn spent another peaceful morning inside the modest chamber overlooking the gardens. She watched gardeners preparing flower beds for winter while birds settled upon stone fountains untouched by the turmoil surrounding her. The same young guard who had offered her a blanket returned carrying breakfast. His expression had changed since the previous evening. Instead of suspicion, quiet concern now filled his eyes. Unable to ignore his doubts any longer, he gently asked whether she regretted confessing. Evelyn looked toward the distant forest beyond the palace walls and answered that regret belonged to people who wished they had chosen differently. She simply hoped the people she had tried to protect would never have to make the same impossible decision. The guard lowered his eyes, unable to imagine carrying such a burden without resentment. At nearly the same hour, one of Alexander's investigators returned from Willow Creek with unexpected news. Several villagers described seeing a frightened young woman running through the forest on the very morning the royal satchel disappeared. Yet none of them had ever mentioned Evelyn until royal investigators publicly announced her confession. Another witness quietly admitted that rumors identifying Evelyn as the thief had spread before any official announcement reached the village. Someone had planted suspicion long before evidence existed. As afternoon shadows stretched across the palace corridors, Alexander gathered every report discovered during the day. Altered archive drafts, contradictory witness statements, missing evidence, and rumors appearing before the investigation itself all pointed toward a single conclusion. Evelyn had never become the target because investigators followed the facts. She had become the target because someone expected her kindness to make her accept blame without resistance. As he reached for the final document resting alone upon his desk, Alexander unfolded a faded page recovered beneath the archive floorboards. Written across it in hurried handwriting appeared a single sentence that caused the room to fall completely silent. It read, "The Omega will confess willingly because protecting others has always been her greatest weakness." In that instant, the Alpha King no longer questioned whether Evelyn was innocent. He understood that from the very beginning, she had been chosen as the perfect sacrifice. Morning arrived beneath a sky covered with pale gray clouds as the capital prepared for what everyone believed would be the final chapter of an already completed case. Long before the palace bells announced the hearing, thousands of citizens filled the streets leading toward the royal council hall. Merchants paused their business, travelers delayed their journeys, and noble families arrived in polished carriages, eager to witness the judgment of the young Omega whose confession had become the kingdom's most discussed tragedy. Rumors had spread farther than truth ever could. Some believed Evelyn Carter had stolen the royal records for gold she had never possessed. Others insisted she had secretly worked for rival kingdoms. Very few questioned why a woman known throughout Willow Creek for helping strangers would suddenly betray the crown without demanding anything in return. Inside the quiet holding chamber overlooking the palace gardens, Evelyn folded the warm blanket the young guard had given her 2 nights before and carefully placed it upon the chair exactly as she had found it. Even now, with uncertainty surrounding every passing moment, she refused to leave another person's kindness unanswered. The same young guard arrived soon afterward to escort her toward the council hall. As he unlocked the wooden door, his hands hesitated. He had watched many prisoners before, yet none had ever carried themselves with such peaceful dignity. Unable to silence the question weighing upon his heart, he softly asked whether she still believed protecting another person had been worth everything she now faced. Evelyn smiled with quiet warmth before answering that a promise measured only by convenience was never truly a promise at all. The guard lowered his eyes, deeply moved by words he knew he would remember long after this day ended. At nearly the same hour, King Alexander Hawthorne stood inside the royal strategy chamber surrounded by every document gathered during the secret investigation. His trusted investigators had worked through the night assembling witness statements, revised archive inventories, and testimony from villagers who described seeing a frightened young servant before Evelyn ever entered the story. The faded note predicting that the Omega would willingly confess rested upon the center of the table beside the altered evidence records. Each discovery strengthened the same conclusion. The confession had not solved the crime. It had been the final step of a carefully prepared trap. One senior advisor urged Alexander to postpone the hearing until every question had been answered completely. The king slowly shook his head. Delaying justice without explanation would only allow whoever orchestrated the deception more time to erase the remaining truth. Instead, he ordered fresh horses prepared immediately and instructed his investigators to bring every original document directly to the council hall. Today, the truth would stand before the entire kingdom instead of hiding inside palace archives. Moments later, the royal council assembled beneath towering stone columns as judges. Nobles, guards, and citizens filled every seat inside the magnificent chamber. Evelyn stood quietly before them, her cream-colored dress and worn brown cloak contrasting sharply against the polished marble floor. When asked one final time whether she wished to withdraw her confession or identify anyone else involved, she gently lifted her head and answered that she alone accepted responsibility for the choices she had made. Her words echoed through the hall, convincing many that the case had finally reached its inevitable end. Hidden among the spectators, Lily Morgan watched with tears filling her eyes as unbearable guilt threatened to overcome every promise Evelyn had protected. She clenched her trembling hands together, fighting the fear that had controlled her since the day she discovered the abandoned satchel. As the chief judge slowly reached for the parchment containing the final judgment, the distant thunder of galloping horses echoed beyond the palace gates. The sound grew louder with every heartbeat until every conversation inside the chamber suddenly stopped. King Alexander Hawthorne had arrived, carrying not only the authority of the crown, but the truth that could change the fate of an innocent Omega before another irreversible word was spoken. The massive doors of the royal council hall swung open with a deep echo that silenced every whispered conversation inside. King Alexander Hawthorne entered with calm, unhurried steps, his dark ceremonial cloak flowing behind him as 4 trusted investigators followed carrying sealed wooden cases filled with original records. No one needed to announce his arrival. Every noble, guard, merchant, and villager instinctively rose to their feet as the Alpha King crossed the polished marble floor toward the center of the chamber. His steady gaze paused only once, meeting Evelyn Carter's quiet eyes. She did not plead for mercy. She did not seek sympathy. She simply bowed her head with the same dignity she had carried since the day she surrendered. Alexander turned toward the council before speaking in a voice that filled every corner of the hall. He declared that the hearing would not continue because the investigation presented to the crown had been incomplete. Murmurs spread through the crowd as several officials exchanged uneasy glances. The chief investigator responsible for the original case insisted that the accused had confessed freely before numerous witnesses. Alexander acknowledged the confession without disagreement. Then he calmly asked whether a confession alone could replace the truth. Without waiting for an answer, he instructed his investigators to present the original archive records recovered during the secret review. One by one, the documents were placed before the council. The altered witness statements appeared beside their untouched originals. Inventory records missing official authorization were displayed next to corrected palace logs. Finally, the faded handwritten page recovered beneath the archive floorboards was unfolded before everyone present. The chamber fell completely silent as Alexander read its chilling sentence aloud. The Omega will confess willingly because protecting others has always been her greatest weakness. Shock spread across every face. The words revealed planning rather than coincidence. They described not a crime but a strategy built upon the predictable compassion of an innocent woman. Several council members immediately demanded an explanation from the officials who had supervised the investigation. Their confidence disappeared beneath the growing weight of undeniable evidence. Before anyone else could speak, a trembling voice echoed from the back of the chamber. Lily Morgan slowly stepped forward through the crowded aisle, tears shining in her eyes as hundreds of strangers turned to watch her approach. Every step seemed to cost her another piece of courage, yet she continued until she stood beside Evelyn. With trembling hands folded tightly together, Lily admitted that she had discovered the abandoned royal satchel outside the archive and fled because fear convinced her no one would believe an ordinary servant carrying confidential records. She confessed that Evelyn had found her in the forest, comforted her, and promised to protect both her and her family. Evelyn had never stolen anything. She had simply chosen to carry blame that belonged to no innocent person at all. The council hall remained frozen in stunned silence. Villagers who had once repeated rumors lowered their eyes in shame. The young guard who had escorted Evelyn quietly looked away, overwhelmed by the realization that every gentle answer she had given had been completely truthful without ever betraying the promise she had chosen to keep. Alexander walked toward Evelyn until only a few feet separated them. Looking directly at the council, he declared that compassion could never be accepted as evidence of guilt and that justice built upon assumptions was no justice at all. With the authority of the crown, he immediately dismissed Evelyn's confession as legally unreliable because it had been given to shield another innocent life rather than to admit a crime. Then, before the entire kingdom, he ordered Evelyn Carter released without condition and commanded a full investigation into every official who had manipulated the truth. As the palace guard stepped back and removed every symbol of accusation surrounding her, the crowd no longer saw a condemned Omega. They saw a woman whose greatest act had never been breaking the law, but keeping a promise even when it cost her everything. Silence lingered inside the royal council hall long after the guards removed every symbol of accusation from around Evelyn Carter. The weight that had filled the chamber only moments earlier slowly gave way to something unfamiliar. It was not celebration. It was reflection. Citizens who had repeated rumors without question now struggled to meet the eyes of the young Omega they had so quickly judged. Several nobles quietly lowered their heads while merchants standing near the entrance whispered apologies that Evelyn could not even hear. The truth had exposed more than a false confession. It had revealed how easily fear could convince good people to believe the worst about someone whose only mistake had been choosing compassion over self-preservation. Lily Morgan stood beside Evelyn with tears still shining across her cheeks. She tried several times to speak, but every attempt dissolved beneath overwhelming guilt. Finally, she managed to whisper that she was sorry for every painful moment Evelyn had endured because of her silence. Evelyn gently reached for Lily's trembling hands and assured her that carrying guilt forever would only create another innocent victim. She reminded the young servant that courage sometimes arrived later than people expected, but it remained courage all the same. Those quiet words dissolved the last barrier inside Lily's heart, and she wept openly with the relief of finally telling the truth. Nearby, the young palace guard who had watched over Evelyn stepped forward and respectfully returned a folded brown cloak that had been taken when she first entered custody. He admitted that he had doubted her despite every calm answer she had given. Evelyn accepted the cloak with the same grateful smile she had offered him before, thanking him for the blanket that had made the cold nights easier. The guard stood speechless, realizing she remembered kindness even after experiencing injustice. From across the chamber, King Alexander Hawthorne observed the exchange without interrupting. The quiet dignity surrounding Evelyn spoke more powerfully than any defense she could have offered. She had not demanded recognition when accused, and she did not seek revenge now that her innocence had been proven. Alexander understood that such character could never be manufactured during a trial. It revealed the kind of person she had always been. Turning toward the assembled council, the Alpha King issued new royal instructions that every investigation involving serious accusations would require independent review before judgment could be finalized. No confession would ever again replace careful examination of the truth. The order echoed through the hall as scribes hurried to record every word. Outside the palace, news of Evelyn's release spread across the capital with astonishing speed. By sunset, people gathered along the streets not to witness punishment, but to quietly watch the young Omega leave the palace as a free woman. Some offered respectful bows while others simply stepped aside, allowing her to pass with the dignity they had once denied her. When Evelyn finally walked beyond the palace gates, she paused for a single moment to breathe the cool autumn air that carried the scent of pine from the distant hills. Freedom felt strangely gentle after days filled with uncertainty. Alexander approached from behind, no longer surrounded by advisors or ceremonial guards. For the first time since their paths had crossed, they stood together without accusation or judgment standing between them. The king thanked Evelyn not only for protecting an innocent servant but also for reminding the entire kingdom that justice lost its meaning whenever compassion became evidence of guilt. Evelyn quietly answered that she had never expected recognition. She had only hoped no innocent family would suffer because of fear. Alexander looked at her with quiet respect, realizing that while many people possessed courage during moments of victory, very few possessed courage when they believed no one would ever know the truth. As the evening sunlight settled across the palace gardens behind them, the kingdom no longer remembered Evelyn Carter as the woman who confessed to a crime. They remembered her as the woman whose unwavering kindness had revealed the true measure of justice itself. Several weeks passed after the hearing, and the kingdom slowly settled into a quieter rhythm, yet the story of Evelyn Carter continued traveling farther than any royal decree. In villages beyond the capital, parents told their children about the young Omega who had chosen another person's safety over her own freedom. Merchants repeated the tale beside crowded marketplaces, and travelers carried it across distant roads until kindness itself seemed to have found a new voice. Back in Willow Creek, life returned to familiar routines. Every morning before sunrise, Evelyn once again walked through the forest gathering herbs, greeting neighbors with the same gentle smile she had always worn. She never spoke about the council hall or the accusations that had nearly changed her life forever. When grateful villagers apologized for doubting her, she simply thanked them for welcoming her home and encouraged them to judge the next frightened stranger with greater patience than they had shown her. Those words quietly transformed the little village more than any public speech ever could. Lily Morgan remained in the capital, continuing her work inside the royal archive under new supervisors appointed by King Alexander Hawthorne after the investigation uncovered serious failures within the system. Determined never to let fear guide her choices again, Lily devoted herself to protecting the truth with the same courage Evelyn had once shown her. She wrote letters to Willow Creek every month, each one ending with the same promise that she would spend the rest of her life honoring the kindness that had saved both her and her family. Meanwhile, Alexander often found himself thinking about the young woman who had expected nothing in return for her sacrifice. During one quiet autumn afternoon, he left the palace with only a small escort and rode toward Willow Creek without announcing his visit. He found Evelyn kneeling beside a shallow stream, helping two children gather smooth stones while laughing at their endless questions about birds and wildflowers. She noticed the king's arrival only after the children excitedly pointed toward the horses waiting along the trail. Rising to her feet, she greeted Alexander with the same respectful warmth she offered every visitor, making no distinction between a crowned ruler and an ordinary traveler. The simplicity of that moment reminded Alexander why her character had impressed him more deeply than any title or noble birth ever could. As they walked together beneath towering maple trees glowing with brilliant shades of gold and crimson, neither spoke about the trial that had first connected their lives. Instead, they spoke about the kingdom, about the importance of listening before judging, and about the quiet strength carried by people who performed acts of kindness without expecting applause. When they reached the hill overlooking Willow Creek, a cool breeze stirred the falling leaves around them. For a brief moment, the world seemed unusually still. The faint silver mark hidden beneath Evelyn's wrist shimmered softly in the afternoon light, and almost at the same instant, an identical mark appeared beneath Alexander's sleeve. Neither had been visible before that day. Ancient stories described such marks as the moon bond, a rare sign that appeared only after two hearts had proven themselves worthy through truth, compassion, and unwavering honor rather than pride or power. They looked at one another with quiet surprise, understanding that destiny had waited until justice was complete before revealing what had always been possible. No dramatic declaration was needed. Some promises were written long before words could ever express them. As the first evening stars appeared above the peaceful valley, the Alpha King and the gentle Omega stood side by side, knowing that the strongest bond was never created by fear, authority, or fate alone. It was earned through courage, protected by kindness, and strengthened every time someone chose the truth even when no one else could see it.